Thank you. So Austin just brought back a memory. I did meet him as a high school student. And as I remember a little differently, my colleague Chip Case, who with me designed the Case-Shiller home price indices, told me, we have this remarkable young high school student, and he wanted me to meet him. And then we got in a car. Austin, are you still there? Do you remember where somehow we got to know each other? That was a number of years ago, so it sticks in my mind. So what I wanted to talk about, I think it fits in well with the Chicago Humanities Festival, because I want to talk about economics as having not enough attention paid to the humanities. This is an example of what we call behavioral economics as opposed to classical economics. Classical economics has everybody perfect, smart, perfectly selfish, forward-looking, attentive to all the data. But we know that that doesn't quite work. So, but for, well, I should also maybe on this occasion remind you that Professor Richard Thaler here in Chicago just won the Nobel Prize in economics. And that was for his work in behavioral economics. He has a nice book called Misbehaving, which you can read. He and I have been colleagues also for a long time. And, but his approach is more psychology department. I think that we have a unity of knowledge, and people in different subdisciplines have to get together more. So I thoroughly applaud the psychology department. But I think I'm going to talk a little bit more like history department or English department in this lecture about. So anyway, Richard Thaler, however, was a big formative influence on my life. But while we're mentioning psychologists, I should mention my wife, Ginny Schiller, who I see there somewhere, who is a psychologist and just finished a book on attachment, which I recommend. And I thought I should also thank Richard Franke. There you are, yeah. Who, as I understand it, was the founder of, or originator of the Chicago Humanities Festival. He's also, okay. He is also a Yale alumnus and a member of the Yale, well, a fellow of the Yale Corporation for many years. And he just endowed the Franke Program for Science and the Humanities at Yale. So we are also very thankful to Mr. Franke. Let me talk about an outline of what I'm... Okay, so I want to start by talking about beliefs and the reality of beliefs. People believe a lot of things that they don't know much about. You tend to absorb them from people around you. You can't believe something if you've forgotten about it, right? There has to be reminders. So we have symbols that represent beliefs. And we have rituals that we go through that reenact a narrative often that reminds us. And also reminds us that other people believe this. So we know that it's part of our identity to believe these sorts of things. But I'm emphasizing particularly narrative. So what is narrative? It's a telling of a story. You could have one story and many different narratives about it. But what makes a narrative distinct is it's a telling of the story that's convincing, motivating, generates emotions, and you run through it in your mind later. You keep thinking back to it. And it may have a theory behind it. And the theory is enlivened by some human example, and maybe with visual images. You have a picture of something going on. I think that neuroscience is leading us toward this understanding of the human mind, that often we don't really know why we believe something, except well, we trust other people and we remember it, and so it comes up, and you have a good feeling about it. So I don't mean to be sounding too cynical, but this is my understanding of how beliefs often work. But I want to apply it to economics and argue that we need to think more about narratives. And I'm going to also make a little foray into the medical school with epidemiology and going viral. So people think that going viral, that's where you put on something on the internet and it suddenly gets a million hits or a billion hits. It's like spreading like a disease. But actually going viral is not new with the internet. It happened all the time. So I'll talk about how viruses move and how ideas also move. And I want to talk about depressions and financial crises, particularly in the context of unemployment, the stock market, and home prices. And finally, I'll conclude with a belated mention of our two presidents, Obama and Trump, both who had prodigious powers of narrative, amazing powers of narrative, but with different style, as you might have noticed. So let me start with the profession of economics. What I did here, if you look at the black lines, I looked at the total the percent of all scholarly articles in each of these fields that had the word narrative in it. The black line is for all dates, going back to the history of these scholarly journals, and the gray line is for since 2010. What you see is that, well, economics and finance are the fields with the least attention to narratives. And secondly, you can see that all fields are paying more attention to narratives now. We're thinking about going viral much more often than we used to. And it's affected all of these disciplines. So I see a trend. What I regard what I'm saying here today is like the beginnings of an understanding of the relevance of narratives and beliefs to economics. It's going to be more, there's going to be more. Now that we have big data and computers that we can analyze it with, we're going to see more and more attention to narratives. I have one slide with some mathematics on it. My apologies. Some people don't like mathematics. I'm not, you might think I'm opposed to mathematical economics, but I'm not. I should also add, I was president of the American Economic Association last year, and we had our convention here in Chicago in January, and I presented this and some more mathematics about this as my sign of where economics, mathematics should move, not dismissing mathematics. So this is just the most famous original model that mathematical epidemiologists have. It's 90 years ago. Mathematical epidemiology is a mature discipline, but economists generally don't know anything about it. But this is just a beginning model. I'm not saying this is the right one. But the idea is that we're going to have a population that has a share S susceptibles who could catch the disease. But now we're talking for a moment about diseases like influenza. I are the people who are infective, they've got it, and they're spreading it. And R are the recovereds who have gotten over it. And the critical equation here, if you'll excuse me to refer to math here, is the center one. It says the infectives increase by a constant contagion rate times the product S times I, which talks about, S times I gives you an indication of how many people are meeting each other and have the opportunity to spread the disease, minus the recovery rate times the number of infectives. So there's two things that are happening. There's contagion and there's recovery. And I don't know if you've completely absorbed this, but there's two parameters to this model. So here's an example of the outcome of this is an epidemic that I've simulated with the Kermack-McKendrick model. And the number of infected is the solid line. And you can see it's hump-shaped. This is standard epidemic. Even if there's no change in the contagion rate and the recovery rate, the epidemic will grow from very small beginnings, and then it will be accelerating madly, wildly, and the hospitals will be filled with sick people. And then mysteriously, it'll stop and it will start declining. Why does it stop? It's because there aren't enough infectives relative to the number of susceptibles, so that there aren't enough meeting. People aren't meeting in a way that could spread the disease. So the contagion is lower than the recovery, and then the whole epidemic dies. That's our model that I want to see economists make more reference to. We'll come back to this. But take a look at this curve. We're going to see it again in data, that big data generated data about narratives. But let me just first emphasize, when I'm talking about narratives, I'm talking about human behavior. I'm not talking about monkeys, birds, or anything else. Humans are the unique species that is constantly talking. And every human culture has stories, and they love human interest stories. So here's a human interest story. Do you know this book, Family of Man? Beautiful book. It shows this, the point is that it shows people doing the same thing from many different cultures. And here a man is telling story to the children. But the same thing happens all over. That we talk and we embellish and we get people excited about the details of a story. And then we run through them in our minds later and we tell them again. And so they spread. So a number of people have proposed that we should change the name of our species from Homo sapiens, which means wise man, to Homo narrator. Or there's different versions. These people didn't check with each other, and they should have conducted a Latin scholar to get this right. Here's an example of some epidemic. Now, I did this for my AEA, American Economic Association presentation. I took a number of famous economic theories, okay, and counted the number of articles. Well, this is the number of mentions in books as a fraction of words of these theories using Google Ngrams. And they all follow the curve that we see at Kermack-McKendrick, right? It's all a hump shape. So this is the Multiplier Accelerator model written by Paul Samuelson in 1939. There's 1939. No reaction until 15, 20 years. It was maybe slowly building, but it suddenly appears like an epidemic. Mysteriously, suddenly we have an epidemic of Multiplier Accelerator. It grows for a better part of a decade, and then it just decays away. This is life. This is the way it is for any model. It's not like it was proven right or proven wrong. It's like a story. And people love the story of young Paul Samuelson, the genius economist, for a while, and then they forget about it. That's reality. Now, some people object to my using narratives, where they say, narratives, how do you know that they're causal of anything that happens? Maybe they're just reacting to things. But there have been many studies outside of economics. We can't do a controlled experiment as readily in economics as we can in other fields. But for example, in marketing, Jennifer Escalis showed that marketing works better if it has the form of a story. You see these on TV all the time, right? They know your demographics. They know what age and sex you are because they've got statistics on it. They show someone just like you promoting the product. They don't have a scientist coming on and explaining it. You want to see a story. And why do they do that? Because it works. They know. Or law, I'm just giving you another from this list. If you want to get a conviction, and you're a lawyer and you're doing your summary statement, you tell a story. You say, this is how the crime happened. And you say, he went in here and he did this. But you better have salient, vivid details. The details matter. They get a mental image. Oh, yeah, he really did this crime. So you should frame it as a story. So I think we know. Now, I was kind of disappointed. There hasn't been much attention to the anniversary that we're celebrating right now, this year. I see a few of you nodding. We just passed the 500th anniversary of the founding of Protestantism. Now, some of you are Catholic and some of you are Protestant, but you both, or other religions, but I think you will both recognize that this is an important, the Reformation. Now, how was it started? Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King, Martin Luther was a monk, and he walked up to the front door of his church, and he nailed a list of complaints against the Catholic Church to the door. That's very bold, to nail 95 complaints to the door of the church. And it set off the whole Reformation. All those Protestant churches came after Martin Luther. Now, I'm thinking about a lot of people, maybe I could ask, I won't ask for a show of hands. Many of you have this image of Martin Luther nailing his complaints to the door. Maybe some of you don't, but a lot of people do. Even 500 years later. And part of it, I just did a Google image search. I can get so many pictures of that event. So he could have just published it, discreetly, but he nailed it to the door. By the way, the diet of worms. Remember the diet of worms? They put him on trial and they sentenced him to death. This was a bold move in 1517. That makes it even better. They didn't end up. He ran away. They didn't get him. But it also, I think, part of it has to do with other stories that were circulating at the time. Something happened and went viral. So there was a saying. Now we've got these different. There was a saying in German which I won't read. Translating to English, as soon as the money in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. It rhymes in English and it rhymes in German, okay? Now what does this mean? Because the church was selling indulgences. They said, if you give money, throw money into the coffer, we'll release your wayward son or whoever, or ancestor who's in purgatory and send him to heaven. And that didn't sound right to a lot of people. It sounded like the church was tricking you. And so he translated into Latin. He lost the rhyme. Maybe Martin Luther, he wasn't a poet, but he was an opera. He knew how to get people excited. And it just swept all of Europe. I mean, so I did a count of references to Martin Luther from 1500 on engrams. But unfortunately, engrams is not good about digitizing the 1500s. That's kind of, but you get a sense that Martin Luther was really big in the 50s. I mean, he was everywhere. This is another epidemic curve, but it's not measured accurately. And then he comes along, and he seems to take off since 1950. But then I realized, no, that's Martin Luther King. And then there's little Karl Marx. I'm talking like Donald Trump here. Little Karl Marx, who can't really compete with that. Well, sort of. He's losing now. He's fading away. But again, Karl Marx is an epidemic curve. By the way, Karl Marx died in 1883. Most of the Karl Marx epidemic came after he died. So this is The Economist magazine 5 years ago had an article about Martin Luther and how he went viral. And so I'm just quoting it. They could publish books cheaply, and I'm just speeding through this. The Economist said that a pamphlet like Martin Luther was writing would cost about the same amount as a chicken in 1517. So you could afford it. It's probably kind of expensive, but you'd buy it and you'd show it around to your friends. Millions of people got Martin Luther's message in months. It just spread like wildfire. And the church, they tried to kill Martin Luther, the church, Catholic. Eventually, the Catholic Church had to reform. And the whole world moved to a more individualistic stance that reflected this revolution. I'll give you another example of something going viral. And this is Arthur Laffer. This is much more recent and not as important as the Protestant Reformation. But Arthur Laffer was at a restaurant with Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, big, important Washington people. And he drew this curve. which is a way of justifying cutting taxes and thinking it doesn't matter because we'll stimulate the economy, and so we'll just all be better off if we cut taxes. But it takes the form of a sort of economist, almost a joke. It's very clever. So he says, if the tax rate, the vertical axis is the tax rate. If the tax rate is 0, you won't collect any revenue, obviously. If the income tax rate is 100%, you're not going to collect any revenue either because nobody will work if you tax all of it. So what he said is for any amount of revenue that you have to collect, let's say it's 1,000, there's going to be 2 tax rates that do it. This is the tax rate that Democrats approve of, and this is the tax rate that Republicans approve of. And you get the same revenue. Clever. I got to give it to Art Laffer. He's a smart guy. He knows how to do a punchline. But it was actually Jude Wanniski, who, as a writer, who produced a book that made it go viral. It went viral so much that Ronald Reagan was elected president right after that, and Margaret Thatcher was part of it too. But it didn't penetrate France, and the French people elected François Mitterrand, the first socialist president of France. Why not? Well, somehow the story just didn't go viral in France. It didn't appeal to our egos or their egos or something like that. But so important is Art Laffer. And now this detail that he wrote that curve on a napkin at a restaurant. So the National Museum of American History in Washington called Jude Wanniski and said, "Can we get the napkin?" And so this is now on the permanent exhibit of the Museum of Natural History. Now, why is it so? Now, incidentally, Art Laffer doesn't remember doing it. And so it might be a forgery, but it doesn't matter. So somehow the story went viral, and it has this visual image in it. That's the curve for both books and news and newspapers, showing the mention of the Laffer curve. It starts abruptly with Jude Wanniski's book. It peaks a few years later, and then it decays. But you know what? It's coming back. So there's something making it viral again. I don't mean that the contagion rate is always constant, but that's the story I'm telling. Now, I want to talk about the unemployment rate. This is the unemployment rate in the United States from 1890 to right now. The data before 1929, I think, are from Christina Romer, who was the immediate predecessor of Austin at the Council of Economic Advisors. So we know pretty well what the unemployment rate in the United States was since 1890. Do you know what this is here? It's the Great Depression. Then most people are surprised at this one. This is another depression, the depression of the 1890s. You forgot about it, didn't you? And so the depression of the 1890s was almost as big, but we've totally forgotten about it. Well, then I take that back. You haven't forgotten about it. I think most of you do remember it, but it's so distorted and it's disconnected from other things. So here's what you remember, this. You remember this? It's called Wizard of Oz, and it was a story written in 1900 by L. Frank Baum during the election when President McKinley was trying to be reelected, and William Jennings Bryan was the Donald Trump, the populist, who was criticized by intellectuals left and right and came really close to winning the presidency, which would, if you trust the urban intellectuals of that day, be a total disaster. But Baum liked Bryan. And so this man, this is the Wizard of Oz, is President McKinley. He published it he was obviously connected and thinking about the revolution. And this little girl goes down the yellow brick road, which is the gold standard, wearing silver slippers, or they changed that to ruby slippers in the movie. But it was all content. It was talking about economics, but it put it in such a lovable story that I assume not all of you remember this, but most people know it's one of the most famous American stories of all time. But it's totally, you have no connection, probably. That's because the stories didn't make the connection. They didn't tell you, they didn't put the symbols or rituals or something that would cause you to remember. We're talking about the 1890s. But do you remember this? Any of you recognize this photograph? This was Dorothea Lange's chronicle of suffering during the Great Depression. So we remember the Great Depression. We don't remember the Wizard of Oz. We remember the Wizard of Oz. We don't know what it's about. We're confused. We're like in a delirium. This is a Google Ngrams count for the number of times the words Wizard of Oz appears. Huge. In fact, you know what? It's been growing. The movie came out in 1939, I think. It's growing much more after that. Even, I might point out, Karl Marx died, and his legend grew after him. He wasn't really that important when he was alive. He became important later. But the Great Depression has emerged as a huge story. This is, Ngrams stops in 2008, dominating the world Wizard of Oz and totally destroying the Depression of the 1890s. We just don't remember that at all. So here is but you know what really brought the Great Depression back? It was the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. Look at that. This is mentions of the Great Depression. It all came back. It was like a latent memory that we hung on to. But now the fear of the Great Depression could have brought back another depression, I think, but we didn't let it because people like Ben Bernanke and other central bank heads couldn't stand the thought that there'd be another depression, so we took extreme measures against it. Now I want to talk about the stock market. I have too much to say, by the way. I'm running out of time. For now, this is my chart of blue is the real inflation-corrected stock market for the United States, and green is earnings. And you can see where we are now. We're at a record high. But we've had record highs like this, and they corrected downward. What made them correct downward? So some of you might read the New York Times. Do you read that in Chicago? I wrote a column about 2 weeks ago there about the 1987 crash, which you can see right there. But it was a one-day crash. It was the biggest one-day crash ever. I was relying on a Keynesian beauty contest theory of the Depression. You're not economists, right? You ever heard of John Maynard Keynes? Some of you have. Well, in his 1936 book, he said, the stock market is like a beauty contest. And he's referring to a particular kind of beauty contest that newspapers were running back in his day. So this is what the newspaper would do. They would have a page with 100 pretty faces on it, and you would be asked as a participant to pick the 6 prettiest in your estimation and put them on paper and mail them to the newspaper. And then the newspaper would get all the entries, and it would figure out what the most popular one was, the second most popular one, et cetera, down to 6. And then they would look for the entry that was closest to the average. Now, this is a funny kind of contest. What do you do to win this contest? So Keynes said, do you pick the girls or the faces you think are prettiest? No, you want to pick the faces that you think that other people think are prettiest. But that's not right either. You want to pick the faces that you think that other people think are the most famous. And that's the name of the game. So but that's what we do in the stock market. You're not trying to pick the best companies. You're trying to pick the companies that will be thought of by other people in a month's time as the best companies, so you can flip it to them. So I think this is the thing. So much of the stock market is driven by people trying to guess what other people are thinking. I don't care about what the company is doing, unless I'm a long-term investor. But short-term investors just want to discover. Now, what I was talking about in my column was about the October 19th, 1987 stock market crash. Another anniversary. We just passed the 30th anniversary. And I could give a whole talk about this, because I was very interested in it when it happened. But what I concluded was that there were reasons to think that other people were thinking that the stock market, because of something called portfolio insurance and because of similarities to the Great Depression, Other people are thinking of selling. So the minute something happens, you want to beat them and get out. And then as it gets more, accelerates, more and more people do that. So I thought of it as something like what happens at, there were a number of cases. This is a dramatic one shown. On August 28, 2016, there was a panic at the Los Angeles LAX airport, and people started running. They called the police and ran in. What is it? And some people said, there's a shooter. I said, where's the shooter? There was no shooter. Maybe there was a noise that made, somehow they got scared, and they saw other people running. So they interpreted other people running as evidence that there was a shooter. But there was no one who even tried to scare them. They just scared themselves. It's because they were thinking that other people are thinking that there might be a shooter. And so they thought they'd run too. This kind of thing could happen any day, I believe. I'm not saying it will happen soon, but it could happen. And it depends on what people think other people are thinking. This is home prices. And now again, I've told you I have a home price index called the Case-Shiller Home Price Index. S&P CoreLogic Case-Shiller now, home price index. And you can see what home prices have done since 1890. And they had this huge run-up here, peaking in 2005, and then this huge collapse in the financial crisis. And now we're on another run-up. But it's not related to any variables that you might think of. So I think it's a story. It's a narrative-driven event. So what is the story? Oh, by the way, I wanted to show 3 cities. Looking at the data is often surprising. People don't look at data. I'm sorry if I'm bothering you with these tedious charts and all these. But most people like stories, human interest stories, and they never look at the data. But this is the actual real home price index, Case-Shiller Home Price Index, for 3 cities since 1987. But I've corrected them for inflation so that they're, and it's kind of, you can see the boom. This is the big boom in home prices. And it affects all 3 cities on 3 different parts of the United States. But it doesn't live up to your expectations, probably. And especially, I shouldn't come to Chicago and say this. But in real terms, Chicago home prices now are lower than they were in 1988. That's not part of the narrative. But you can see it here. Look, the blue line is Chicago. And look where it's not much lower. It's almost exactly the same as it was almost 30 years ago. Now, why didn't you know, or did you know that? Well, some of you knew that. But why didn't most of you know that? Because it's not a good narrative. This, you can't fight it. The narrative is, if it's contagious, stories about speculation are so contagious. Stories like this just don't cut it. And so the people's information is selective. So what I've done is looked at the narrative about flipping houses. What is a flipper? It's someone who buys a house, fixes it up a little bit, does some cosmetic changes, and sells it for a lot more. Those stories were going viral but it actually started out with condominium sales in the 70s. The word flipping wasn't even used, at least in the popular media, until the condo flippers appeared in the 70s. Then it moved over to IPOs in the 1990s. And it first started attracting attention for houses in 2005. So this is the count of newspaper articles mentioning flipping of houses. It's still going. We're still flipping them. We haven't learned that they haven't gone up in 30 years. But I'm not saying that some people make money flipping houses. But I'm sure a lot of them don't. It is a sort of fad. I want to conclude with just a few thoughts about great men of history. I personally am not an admirer of great men or women generally, because usually it's just some viral story that. So let's start with Karl Marx. I pointed out before that he is struggling to keep his head up relative to Art Laffer or someone else. But this came from a book by Mark Skousen about great economists. The story that Skousen writes is that's Karl Marx. He got a gift from his friend Kupferman of a bust of Zeus, the Greek god. And Kupferman said, "Karl, you look like Zeus." And according to Skousen, Karl Marx thought, I really do. Maybe I should cultivate that. Zeus is the king of the gods. And I'm the father of communism, right? I have to look right. So there he is. He grew his beard out, according to Skousen, at that time. And he looks fierce, doesn't he? He really looks like the father of communism. This was late in his life, as you can tell. This is his sidekick, Friedrich Engels, who grew his beard out. I think he really needs a trim. Even in those days, that's pretty outrageous. But hey, this is going to be the communist look. It's an image. Now, Mr. Louis Blanc was another communist. Did you ever hear of Louis Blanc? And look at his beard. He just didn't know how to be a showman. So this is Karl Marx compared with Zeus. The interesting thing is, Karl Marx never made it to the levels that Zeus did. And Zeus was undergoing a revival in the 19th century. This was why Karl Marx's timing was right to become Zeus again. How did Zeus do it? He wasn't doing anything. He doesn't exist. It's purely a virus. It's something going viral. This is another favorite story of mine. Do you know who that is? Albert Einstein. This is Edwin Schrodinger. Who was the greater physicist? Well, I don't know if there's any physicists in the room, but it's hard to tell. They both did breathtakingly important works in physics. But look at their n-grams counts. Albert Einstein stands out dramatically ahead of Schrodinger. Some of you probably never even heard of Schrodinger. Now, he's a nice-looking guy, right? But he just doesn't inspire narratives. Narratives are not about nice-looking guys, right? It's supposed to be about something exciting and talked about. He stuck his... This was the best thing Einstein ever did, was to stick his tongue out at the camera and leave his hair looking disheveled like that. Because it fits in with the... It's like an ancient, the prophet or the genius. He becomes an embodiment of a story. Oh, and this is Hugh Hefner, who just died. I don't mean to be disrespectful to the dead, but I was never an admirer of the man. But one thing that he did that I think gave him not eternal fame, he's fading, I'm sure, is he appeared in public wearing pajamas and a bathrobe. If you or I did that, it would be embarrassing, wouldn't it? But he wove it into a story of the Playboy man, the Playboy philosophy, and then became very famous. So here I'm comparing a number of the names I've mentioned so far, on n-grams count. So you see Hugh Hefner, although he did do an awful lot, he just doesn't compare with Donald Trump. This is ending in 2008. McKinley and William Jennings Bryan, that's back from Wizard of Oz days, are still beating Donald Trump as of 2008. But these things, you can see the Donald Trump epidemic is growing. And even if Donald Trump disappeared, it would continue to grow, I think. So I'm going to conclude with just a couple of thoughts about our president. This is President Obama. Every president since Franklin Delano Roosevelt has done regular, well, they were used to be radio addresses. Now they're YouTube addresses. Roosevelt got a lot of fame for his fireside chats, and they were so contagious. They went viral in the 1930s. So every president thinks, I've got to do that. And so Obama does that. But you know what? And he brings Michelle on to give it a human. Do you watch these? Some of you do. But I did a calculation. You can see how many YouTube hits they got. It's like 0.1% of the U.S. population. So you can't repeat what Roosevelt did. And, but what Obama did was brilliant, was to write this book called Dreams from My Father. in 1995, which is a personal storytelling about his problems with racial prejudice and his admiration for this remote man, his father. But it hasn't, this book was so much more, because it brought him to the presidency, I think. It went viral. And then here's Donald J. Trump, who has gone, he actually was quite a success before the presidency with these books. Notably, I like this title, Trump. Isn't that audacious? It's like wearing a bathrobe and silk pajamas in public. Mr. Trump writes a book called Trump, How to Get Rich. I mean, that is audacious. And also, she wrote it, apparently. He even says so. That's Meredith McIver. And there she is down there. She's famous for, she was the one who wrote Michelle Obama's, I'm sorry, not Michelle, Melania Trump's GOP speech, and accidentally put in part of Michelle Obama's speech from a previous convention. And then she offered to resign. She took the hit. A good woman. She admitted. And she said, it's because I admired Michelle Obama. But in this, she wrote, I assume, but it's based on her understanding of him. This is supposed to be Donald Trump talking. I've read stories in which I'm described as a cartoon, a comic book version of the big city business mogul, etc. Gold bathroom fixtures. But my cartoon is real. I am the creator of my own comic book, and I love living in it. If you're going to think big. If you're going to live large. So there we have it. We have Donald J. Trump telling you that he's a constructor of narratives, and he's saying, go do it. You should do it too. Don't worry, he says, it's another point about being boastful. People will get over it. They won't know about your great accomplishments if you don't boast. So I think that is the end of my talk. Okay, so I guess we have time for questions. I'm sorry I ran over a little bit. But you were smiling, and I thought I was encouraged. Thank you.
Excuse me. Pardon. So sorry.
I was wondering if you might give a comment about Moore's law and the evolution of that since the 1960s, et cetera, and whether that has how it relates to a narrative.
Okay, so Moore's law was proposed, I think, in the 60s by an engineer, Moore, and he said that the number of transistors on a chip would double every 18 months, and it was an outrageous statement. That went viral. That statement went viral. So I don't know whether you were asking me to comment on the virality of the statement. It turns out to have been approximately right. And it's an amazing truth. I'm not an engineer, so I can't. The question is, how much longer can that continue to happen? But by the way, it does bring up to my mind the virality of the, I didn't mention it here, but the story that is, one constellation of narratives that is especially important right now is the artificial intelligence, or the computer constellation. And I think it has people, whether it's right or not to worry about it, people are worrying about what will happen to them and their children in coming decades with artificial intelligence proceeding at the rate it is. So maybe machines are going to take over. I think that this is helping propel the stock market, the housing market. It encourages people to save more. It doesn't explain everything, though, because there's so many narratives swirling around. Right now, the U.S. economy is strong and placid. The stock market is not very volatile. I think it reflects the narratives of the day, but in order to try to explain these things with, economists don't like to venture into this kind of thinking. because it's difficult to summarize all the different narratives that are driving things. But the one that you mentioned, Moore's Law, is definitely a viral narrative, and I think it is part of the picture, an important part of the picture of what is going on now in our economy and financial markets.
We have a question back here.
Sure. Hi. Thank you for your time, first of all. I was wondering if you had given any thought to, when you're considering these ideas as epidemics, what qualities of certain ideas / epidemics would cause the skew that we see that differs from person to person, from idea to perhaps rise more rapidly, fall more rapidly. Have you given any thought to what characteristics might shape that skew?
Well, I've given thought to it. This is a difficult question to answer. There's been a movement in literature departments toward what they call deconstruction. It used to be, I'm not a member of one of these departments, but 50 or 100 years ago, if you majored in English, you would find that the professors would give enthusiastic, reverential descriptions of great literature. But now they're pulling back from that. That's called deconstruction. And they're trying to understand what's so great about this and how did they do it. There's a lot of literary theory given that tries to help us understand what it is. A similar thing with music. Why is some music, what is it? Could you develop a computer program? They have computer programs that will write music, but I haven't seen any hits coming out of them, unless you tell me. Could you get a computer program that would identify music, just give it the score, and tell you whether it will be a hit or not? And we don't seem to, we haven't gotten there yet. So there's some essentially human element that is studied by humanities. And I wouldn't presume to be able to just answer I am an economist. I'm saying maybe we should listen more to the people who do study these things. It's a difficult, and also neuroscience. There's people now trying to understand art appreciation and our emotional experiences by studying the human brain. They still haven't got it either. I've got a long way to go. But what I'm just appealing for here is a respect for reality, that so much of what happens is driven by stories. And stories are hard to pin down. What is their appeal? Why do some movies, why are some of them blockbusters and others perfectly good-looking movies to the critic? The public is not interested in them.
We have a question back here.
Yes, Professor Schiller, could you comment on the rise of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies? How do you value them? How do you know if they're in a bubble?
Okay, do you all know what Bitcoin is? Well, just in case, it's a cryptocurrency. It has the best narrative imaginable. And I think that the people who invented Bitcoin deserve credit on two fronts. One, on cryptography. They're clever applying the mathematical science of codes and decoding. But two, they were great storytellers. And they must have decided at some, so they not known who they are, somebody wrote a actually brilliant paper about how to start a cryptocurrency that would reside on the world's computers and would be beyond the reach of governments and incorruptible. Whether that's exactly true, but that was they had a lot of clever ideas to make that happen. But they decided, normally you'd publish it and get your name out there so you get credit for it. They decided not to do that. They sent off to a cryptography blog an article, a brilliant article, and they signed it Satoshi Nakamoto. Okay, and it launched Bitcoin. But then, who is Satoshi Nakamoto? No one, this was getting close to 10 years ago. No one's found him. Somebody found a Satoshi Nakamoto and wrote an article, I think it was in Newsweek, about they found him. Turns out he wasn't. His name was Satoshi Nakamoto, but he wasn't the one. So I think they did it was a brilliant thing to make it into a mystery story. It's got everyone wondering, where is this guy? How rich is he? He must own a lot of bitcoins. He must be a billionaire, and he's nowhere to be found. Maybe he doesn't. Maybe he never existed, but somebody did it. So I think that this is a testimony. Now, since then, there have been, I think, hundreds of other cryptocurrencies invented. Right now, the news, it was in this morning's Wall Street Journal, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange is thinking of creating a Bitcoin futures market. And they were talking about the technical details of that. And Bitcoins are worth over 100 billion, I think. Does someone have the latest number? 125 billion? Where did this come from? It's a mystery story. But one thing I know about it, I see it from my own students at Yale. When I talk about Bitcoin in one of my lectures, they wake up. And then I'll have several of them come up to me after class and say, I'd like to hear more about that. Why are they so excited about it? It's partly because of the angst young people are feeling now, that they don't feel part of the computer world. And they feel that they might be replaced by some robot. And it's very invigorating to them to think, maybe I can figure this out. And they try to read Nakamoto, and it's tough. You guys, he's a real mathematician. And then they think, well, but I'm gifted. I can do this too. And so it becomes I may be demeaning them a little bit too much. But there's something there. I can see it in their eyes. They're excited by Bitcoin. And it's the same as they were excited 100 years ago by William Jennings Bryan and his bimetallism. There was a best-selling economics book in 1894, I think it was, called Coin's Financial School. And to me, it just has the same feel as the Bitcoin story. The same thing. This is not to say that Bitcoin isn't important, but I'm just interested in the narrative, which is what really brings it to our attention.
And I'm sorry, but on that note, we are out of time. So thank you so very much to Mr. Robert Schiller.
Thank you.